Don, lovely to see you again. I gather you've been through the wars, but you've come out fighting, looking slim, streamlined. It's like you've got extra hair.
Yeah, well, I compensate the loss of weight with the gain of hair. Yes, apparently, in fact, I lost 20 pounds, but gained 6 pounds in my hair. Of course, it also lost in my brain power, but I got to compensate somewhat.
No, that's never going to happen. No, well, I'm glad you're on the main. I'm glad you're in good spirits as well. I'm back in business. So we're going to talk about the scandals surrounding our beloved sport of boxing. And of course, one of the ones that really stand out is Marcellus Cassius Clay against Sonny Liston. Their second fight. 25th of February 1964, or was that the first one?
No, it's 1965 was the.
That was the second one. That's right. So the second one, that phantom anchor punch, shot was that's been taken photos of 1 million times. Did it land? Didn't it land? Why did Liston fall? What was your take on that?
Well, as I said before, this is the Kennedy assassination of boxing. Everyone has a theory, everyone has an opinion, but nobody really has any facts to back it up. And the story went to the grave with both. Well, I don't know about Ali was aware, but certainly with Liston. Look, it's only an opinion, but based on this, as we were talking earlier, the first fight was such a shock that nobody took the then Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, seriously. He was an 8-1 underdog. Liston was as formidable a champ as it had been since probably Joe Louis. No one was going to beat him. And he comes in and he faces this guy who's like, lightning in a bottle. He never expected a man of that size and that speed. They had dismissed the Cassius Clay Muhammad Ali as a joke. And he stood up and he beat Liston. He changed the face of boxing from the slow, ponderous heavyweight to this guy had the speed of a middleweight or a welterweight in certain cases. So it was just a remarkable, kind of performance. Now we go forward to the rematch. Again, I have been of the opinion that Sonny Liston, once he won the heavyweight title by knocking out Patterson in 1962, after fighting for 10 years, after going to prison and getting out, going back to prison and being frustrated every move to get a title fight, he peaked. And as a boxer better than I would ever know, his emotional, his physical, his everything that he had in him. Won that night at the title, was put into it. He won it, and he was done as a fighter. He climbed the highest mountain. There was nowhere else to go. And I think at that moment, Sonny Liston said, I'm done. Not that he was physically drained, but there was nothing else he wanted to do. He had the rematch with Patterson, which I said was won on the residue of his greatness. He just threw the punch one round. You can't tell whether a fighter has it or doesn't. Just managed to land it and drop Patterson the 3 times. It was over. We go fast forward to the first fight, where, as I said, Liston had, I think he had peaked. He had 11 rounds of boxing in 3 years, whereas Ali had a full career. He loses that fight. The rematch is scheduled. So Liston dives down into his tank and says, I'm going to give it one more shot. He trains for a fight in Boston. Everybody's writing he was in great shape. He was looking formidable, that he could beat him. And Ali gets a hernia. Now, whether he faked that or got it or just an act of God, the fight's then postponed. By the postponement period, the governor of Massachusetts, in this controversial time, Liston was mobbed up. Ali was with the black Muslims, who were perceived as, a racist group, more than a religious group at that time. And it was starting the beginning of Vietnam, many things going on in the country. So they moved the fight out. And they moved it to Lewiston, Maine, a small St. Dominic's arena, a small basketball arena for a Catholic school. And it was written by Milton Gross, who was a correspondent or a columnist, a boxing columnist for the New York Post. Sonny Liston has taken on the look of a middle-aged man. So I think reporters were saying that Liston was not the fighter of old, just an old Liston. And goes into the fight. Again, my personal opinion is he just said, look, I'll do my best, but I don't give a damn. Very similar to Duran and Leonard in that rematch, where he just said, no, Moss, I'm not going to let you humiliate me. The strange thing is he goes down and he gets up. When they stopped the fight, he wasn't counting. He was on his feet. Then they went to the timekeeper, and Nat Fleischer and Walcott lost complete control of the fight. Liston may have lost.
Joe Walcott was the referee at the time?
Yes, that's correct. And you would bring in guys, name for their name value. They didn't have to be the greatest referee, but you had a Jim Braddock refereeing title fights, Jack Dempsey. I mean, they did it because they had achieved, fame outside of being a referee, but their skills were not there to be a referee. So he lost control. It was chaotic. Nobody expected Liston to go down on the ground. He gets up, he rolls over. Just a crazy kind of a thing. If anything, I would call it a quit. Now, I've heard that the mafia threatened Liston, that there was a big bet made on Liston, millions of dollars on Ali, that the black Muslims kidnapped Liston's wife and held her hostage. And insane kind of crazy stories, that aliens from space came down and threatened them. I mean, there were bomb threats. It was everything there. But I just think he just got hit and said, I'll try, I get up, and he was on his feet. I just think Walcott lost the count. It was just so crazy. But I don't think that there was a predetermined that he's going to take a dive in that round. I think he got hit, he shot. And remember this, John, Muhammad Ali went on to become the greatest heavyweight of all time. He wasn't a guy, I mean, let's talk about Jack Sharkey taking a dive for Carnera in the heavyweight fight in the 30s. And what happens? In the next fight, Carnera wins a couple of things, battered senseless by Max Baer. So it's not like it was a fluke. He wins the title and loses it right after. He stood up for the next 20 years as a great heavyweight. So this was a great guy, would have beaten Liston on the merits. The question, how did it end? And I just think he just said, I don't have it. I'm not going to. That's it for me. And if you see afterwards, when he makes a comeback, he wins some fights, but he's never this devastating force that he was before.
I think now you put some meat on the bones, especially the fact that he boxed 11 rounds in 3 years. People that only saw the fight itself, then they kind of put things into perspective. And of course, when you get to that point in your career, you're better off having not trained enough or having a little bit left in the tank rather than being absolutely washed up because you've got nothing to dig deep for, nothing to get you back into the fight for. Sonny Liston was that fighter where he'd climbed the mountain, he'd achieved more than he'd ever thought of. And of course, as I mentioned, the fight with Duran against Leonard, that second fight, that's history repeating itself. We'll touch on that later on down the line. Earlier on than that, September 22nd, 1927, Jack Dempsey against Gene Tunney, the long count over in Chicago. Again, mystery surrounds it, scandal surrounds it.
Oh, yeah. Well, there was another thing, again, because Chicago and during Prohibition, Al Capone ran the town. It was all mob infested. Did they pay off the referee to give a long count to Tunney? I mean, the background is this. If you look at Dempsey's earlier fights, and the first one I think we have on film is Dempsey Willard, where he just comes out like a wild tiger. He knocks this guy down. He's on the canvas. He's hitting him while he's down. The guy gets up for 1 second. He knocks him basically through the ring. He's just tearing like a wild man. I think there were 7 knockdowns in the first round. Never would have stood up today. Dempsey never saw a red light when he got into it. There was no yellow or red light for Dempsey. Everything was green. He just keep fighting until, the bell could ring. He'd keep going on. So, I mean, this man was used to just the survival of the fittest. He fought Firpo, knocked out of the ring, comes back into the ring, knocks him down 7 or 8 times. And so when Dempsey saw you hurt, this was like a tiger going after a deer, and he's going to rip you apart. He saw Tunney down there. The idea of go to a neutral corner, Dempsey didn't fathom that. And he stood over his man, and they kept telling him, go to the neutral corner, go to the neutral corner. And he kept standing there. And what happened is Tunney, instead of getting, let's say, a 9 count or a 10 count, I think he got a 16-second or something.
But am I correct in saying before that point, in boxing, the fighter didn't have to go back to the neutral corner once the knockdown was what that would say. They could stand there and wait for the fighter to jump back up again. Was it a new ruling that came in? Was that the confusion?
It was a new ruling, yes. I'll tell you, Dempsey, I've always said he was the most influential figure in the history of the business of boxing. Not so much of the sport as an athlete. He was a great fighter. But because of his popularity, what happened in the 1920s, we got the New York Athletic Commission started, and that was the standardized rules for the United States. The National Boxing Association was an association of all the boxing commissions outside of New York and the US, started about 1921. The British Boxing Board of Control comes in 1929. Now, all of this is an indirect result of Dempsey's popularity. So what they did, they codified the rules. They had statutory bodies, the states in the United States, government institutions ran boxing, where before, John, you had the promoter would appoint the referee, the judges, everything, that they worked for him as an employee. So anything went. There were places where you could have 45-round fights, 25-round fights. They cut it down to 15. And in the case in Chicago, there were only 10-round fights. So there were certain rules, you had to go to a neutral corner. They hadn't started the standing 8 count yet. But before that, it was a free-for-all. You just go there. The man was down. Just look at the difference between, if you can take a chance on and see the film, Dempsey Willard and Tunney and Dempsey, the first fight, even the second fight. And you see there's a boxer who learned his skills differently than Dempsey. You know, he followed rules. There were no rules for Dempsey. It was, again, it's like two cavemen battling it out. And the guy who's standing there is the winner, and the guy with the most lumps on his head is the loser. So it didn't, you know, these rules were something, the instinct of Dempsey took over. His common sense. You know, yeah, these are rules, but I'm in here. When he saw the man down, again, it was like a caged tiger getting out and seeing a wounded antelope. He was not going to say, better sit back and watch and see if he's okay. But no, tore right in there. And again, there were controversy that the referee get paid off, but it was Dempsey, and he never caught up to Tunney again in that fight. And Tunney was a great fighter. You know, he was beating him, but the one opportunity, I think Dempsey, he blew it.
Confusion and instinct. That's what it's all about. Billy Fox, Jake LaMotta, The Dive. The Dive, what was that, 1947?
Yeah, 1947. And this is a guy that, you know, LaMotta had been around a long time. He couldn't get it. You know, guys would wait. We talked about, listen, waiting 9-10 years. These guys would fight everybody. And just, again, it was a survival of the fittest kind of a situation then. And he had been around quite a while, was not getting a title fight. So the story was, and I guess this has been proven because LaMotta himself testified to that effect, that the mob said, we want you to take a dive for this fighter, Billy Fox, who was a mob control fighter, a phony record of a lot of fixed fights on the way to LaMotta. And apparently LaMotta, who had never been stopped, agreed to this. And then within a few years, despite this dive, he gets a world title fight against Marcel Cerdan. He, you know, was brought in, and the amazing thing is he takes this dive. It's well known, and yet he continues to fight. So, I mean, everything was sort of forgiven in those days. You know, later he admitted to that. I think maybe when his career ended, I'm not sure when these hearings were held. They had Keith Alba hearings. But up to that point, whatever the people in the business, they sort of gave a wink and a nod and say, okay, now what about the next fight, Jake? Quite amazing to me.
It's rules change. It's how things looked on different. And that's why legislation and governing bodies are probably part of the reason why they're installed. So these things don't happen. And not accepted. Lewis against Walcott, who got robbed there. That was the first.
That was it. Yes. I mean, Lewis, this was after, I mean, Lewis had come back from World War II. He was a great fighter before, but he just lost the step. He was if you look at Joe Lewis pre-World War II and Joe Lewis post-World War II, and they were to say, here's Joe Lewis, 1946, a 60-year-old man. He looks, John, like a 60-year-old man. I've never seen a fighter age so much as Joe Lewis did between 41 and 1946. He just, you know, they said he dissipated. He didn't, you know, he didn't fight in combat, and he was doing exhibitions, and he was drinking, he was smoking, and he was dissipating, talked about listening. But really, Lewis had lost his peak. So he comes out of the war, and the big fight was Billy Conn. But Billy Conn had deteriorated at the same rate as Lewis, only probably more accelerated. So he was able to knock him out in a big fight, but you could see both of them were gone. He fights Tammy Moriello, which I went back about the one-round knockouts with Liston in the rematch with Patterson. And Moriello hits him a shot, and Joe Lewis throws a punch, catches Moriello, and knocks him out. But again, you couldn't tell because it was a one-round knockout. You know, he just happened to land the right punch at the right. Now he fights Walcott, who had been around longer than Lewis, who had sat there for, I don't know, it was about maybe 13, 14 years as a pro, from the mid-30s, that he was waiting for a title fight. And he sort of caught his strength. You know, certain fighters, John, mature later. Walcott was a greater fighter after he was 30 than before. Lewis was a phenomenon before he was 30. And nobody, again, it was like the Ali and Liston fight. No one gave him a chance. I mean, he was not like Ali, an Olympian and undefeated. Maybe there's a chance. This guy was, commissions turned it down. Many commissions want to say, well, just recognize this as an exhibition because they were so far apart in talent. And as you know, many times in an upset, the underdog, if he performs just better than they expect, the judges, I found, and you can speak to this as well, they give close rounds to the underdog. They say, the guy's surviving in their head. He should be gone in the fourth round. He's still alive. He must be winning the round. So they keep clicking off. But Walcott knocked down Joe Lewis twice in this fight. And everybody felt he won. In fact, on the scorecards, Walcott actually won on the rounds. But there was a supplemental point system where Lewis got it that way. So it's a very funny. If you look at the scorecard, you see Walcott winning 2 out of 3. But on the point system, Lewis got ahead of him. Everybody thought that, you know, Lewis lost.
There were boos in the crowd and everything, weren't they? I remember seeing the footage.
And this is a probably the most beloved figure in the history of boxing in terms of no controversy with Joe Louis. I mean, there was no Ali situations there. There was no Liston situation. Even Robinson was perceived as great, but arrogant. Joe Louis was this universally beloved figure. So to take the title from the icon, it was tough. But, people always, you root for the under, you want fair play. They felt that Walcott won. It was absolutely one of the most controversial decisions of all time and resulted in the rematch where Louis came from behind to knock him out.
Well, at the moment, we're talking about events that have happened that probably didn't rock the foundations of our sport and threaten the existence of our sport. But it was building, slowly but surely building. Another example, Ellis outpointing Patterson.
Yes.
Again, you look at that scandal there, and you think, this is when the people have no voice. They're not listened to, but you see what's happening there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, again, that goes back to a fight. Years ago, I'll tell you what you could do. Well, if you said, I want you to fight overseas, defend your title, and the manager there was saying, I want to bring my own music, which means they want to bring their own referee and judges if they can get away with it. I mean, Bill Daly was a great manager of, Lisa Bold, but more importantly, Carlos Ortiz. And Ortiz fought often overseas. But when he fought, they would have Jim Braddock be a referee. They would have Barney Ross was a referee. There was Joe Walcott, and have Jersey Joe Walcott referee the fight of his in Panama against Ismael Laguna, which he lost the title. But they brought their own judge, Ben Green, a notorious figure, who voted a draw. And one judge had the fight 14 rounds to 1, and this guy had a draw. So they could basically do anything they wanted to do. So when Patterson when they brought Ellis to fight Patterson in Sweden, which was sort of ironically, Patterson knocked out Johansson. When he regained the title, was an idol in Sweden, was Swedish. He became an idol in Sweden. His comeback after the Liston fights were in Sweden. He went there and his brother married a Swedish girl. He married a Swedish girl. So that was like his second home. So when Ellis was brought over there to fight Patterson, Angelo Dundee said, well, I want to name the referee, which was Harold Vallon. And more uniquely, he was not only the referee, he was the sole arbiter. There were no judges, just Vallon. So
wow.
So you had Howard Cosell was a big admirer of Patterson. He covered him in the Olympics and a very controversial figure, but the most influential broadcaster we've ever had in boxing in this United States. And he's saying Patterson is winning. And when the decision is finally rendered, it was an incredible scandal. I mean, they were saying, I think they told 100,000 calls to the network within the next 24 hours complaining about the decision. Whereas the people said, well, we're only the broadcaster. We didn't do that.
And this is where the people are starting to get a voice and that's where things are starting, the sport's starting to be looked at. And then you'd come across Griffiths. He kills he kills an opponent on network, live on network TV. And this is where the governing body thought, now we need to look at this sport seriously from every single angle. And that must have created a massive ripple effect.
Oh, absolutely. Well, by the 1960s, had some great changes. The big idols were now gone. Sugar Ray Robinson, Rocky Marciano retired in 1956. Sugar Ray Robinson lost his last title in 1960. So you had the old guard moving out. The pre-World War II fighters were on their last edge. Archie Moore is going. And we did not build up those kind of idols subsequent. But what you did have is just television saturated the market. So in the US, there was at one point, there were 6 televised shows a week. And these are network TV. And this is not on some obscure cable. This is ABC, CBS, NBC would be like the equivalent of the BBC and ITV in Britain. So when Griffith fights Benny Paret, they had 30 million people watching that. And they wrote the next day in the paper, this was like an execution in front of 30 million. And who's watching this? You've got kids, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids watching it. You've had grandmothers watching it. You had everybody watch boxing. There was priests and everyone else. And they saw this unbelievable, horrific event. And there was so boxing it had been scandalized with the mafia by the 60s, the Keith Albert hearing where Jake LaMotta came out and said he took the dive. They had Sonny Liston as the heavyweight champ, who really no one wanted, an ex-convict with a horrible reputation. It had been belted and battered. The idols, I said, of the pre-war that people really loved, like Marciano and Robinson, Joe Louis, were all retired by them. And so on top of all of this, you have this basically a murder on television, execution on TV. And then within 12 months of that, in the second largest city in the United States, you have Sugar Ramos kills Davy Moore in a featherweight title. So now you got the East Coast and the West Coast, the centers of population saying, what's this? This is boxing. The hell with boxing. This is murder. And as a result, they did institute, 4 ropes, standing 8 counts. A lot of safety issues came by and did that. That was a shocking thing, as they said. So it was like Lee Harvey Oswald when he got shot by Jack Ruby on national TV.
So, and that's what I'm saying, that the people's, they probably had no power with a voice, but eventually when enough spoke, the governments and everybody's there, they're saying, look, but boxing, I suppose the sport is boxing like cockroaches. You can't get rid of the fight game. It goes underground, or you regulate it and try and control it. But unfortunately, there's always been a bit of scandal there. There always has been, and probably always will be. We'll move further forward in time. Whittaker against Chavez. Yeah. Again, the scandals still roll on. Times are supposed to have moved on, education, intelligence, but it still happens all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't, you can't, I don't know what you get. I think a lot, well, I remember Mickey Vann was one of the officials in that, the British official, and he wins his decision. And remember, Whittaker had been a victim of a very bad decision against Jose Luis Ramirez when he first challenged for the title. That was in France. But now you get Chavez, the Mexican idol. He's fighting in San Antonio. There were 60,000 people there. 599,990 were there for Chavez. The family of Whittaker was there for him. And they're roaring. If Chavez faked the jab, they would stand up and cheer. If Chavez backed off and missed the punch, they would stand up and cheer. And Whittaker's just totally outboxing him. And the commentators, and I will say this, the commentators play a large role in this, because if they're saying one guy's winning, whether they're right or wrong, this is influencing the public. They're saying, well, they're saying it, they must be right. But of course, anybody who saw the fight felt that Whittaker clearly won. And when it was a draw, which again, it preserved the title, but it didn't, he didn't lose, but he lost the glory of having that victory of Chavez. Interestingly enough, I can guarantee you this, had it been the other way around, where the perception was Chavez was robbed, you would have had a rematch order. You notice they never fought again, although I'm sure Whittaker would be willing to do so, but they never had a rematch. That was the end of it. It was a one and done.
Once bitten, twice shy. Now that's boxing. So things that a real curveball that really makes people sit and think, what is this? Mike Tyson's biting the ear of Evander Holyfield. That was like, people that weren't even interested in boxing knew about it. It was on the front and the back of the newspapers. This was like, what sort of barbaric sport is this? The scandal it caused.
Yeah, no, and Tyson didn't back off. He didn't say, I'm sorry, it was a terrible thing. He was sort of like a Dempsey of his day. The hell with it, this is boxing. Yes, I'll tear off his ear. Next time I bite off his nose. It was quite amazing. And of course, he was fined and suspended and everything else. But the mystique of Mike Tyson, again, he's sort of in that category of Stanley Ketchel and Jack Dempsey. No matter what they do, he has formed a niche there that he is such an idol. John, I'll tell you, I get calls all the time. Can I get a personal appearance by a boxer and this and that? Everybody wants Tyson. He turns down $250,000 offers to show up for a weekend somewhere. No matter what he did, John, you can see he's just got the mystique, and he's fallen. He lost to Francis. He lost to Kevin McBride. Terrible fights with guys who never could have.
Went to jail. Went to
prison on a rape charge, not on beating someone else, on a rape charge. This guy is just, I don't say he's the Teflon Don, but he's something special, that he just has a mystique that the public has forgiven him, forgotten. Now he's got the reputation as a big teddy bear rather than a grizzly bear. But it's amazing how he stood up. But yes, that was among the most scandalous things. And yet again, boxing, we're all forgiving. That's the end of Tyson's career. No, he comes back and has a career after that, ends up fighting Lennox Lewis, ends up probably fighting half a dozen times and makes more millions of dollars. We are the most forgiving of any industry I've ever known. Also, even the mafia kills the people when they screw up.
But even that in television skits, he'll be joking about biting the ear off of Evander Holyfield. It's now put sort of a joke thing. Who was vilified the most, him or Ali for becoming a black Muslim?
Yeah, it was sort of two different perceptions, isn't it? Again, the time, and I grew up, I was young then, but the black Muslims were sort of a white America feared that. They didn't know, we didn't know we were going to be on the throes of a revolution. We had race riots in the street after years of, there was bigotry and racism and things like the North was not as overt as the South. There weren't the lynchings and the Ku Klux Klan running about. But I'll tell you, I grew up and I'm from New York. And it was almost like an apartheid system. I don't know how it is in England. There were black neighborhoods, and today you still have traditional black neighborhoods, Harlem, etc. You never saw a white person in your neighborhood, and they probably never saw a white person unless they came in on business or something like that. But it was even more so. In New York, we were ethnically divided. There was the Irish neighborhood, and next to that, the Italian neighborhood. Next to that, the Jews. And these people didn't intermingle. It was quite unbelievable. There were no Jewish people on. Yeah,
sort of like a different country in a country.
It was a country within the country, absolutely. And there was sort of like unwritten rules. You're not going to that neighborhood. Like maybe you went into the Italian, have Italian food, and then you get right out again. But it was quite amazing how it was. And it wasn't a brutal, nobody hated anybody. It was just sort of, this is how we grew up culturally. This is the way it is. You know, Irish kids married Irish women. Jewish people married Jewish people. You didn't have, forgetting about an interracial family. You didn't have an inter-ethnic family. You didn't marry interreligion. It was quite amazing for that period of time. And then the 60s broke and it changed everything.
So somebody who decided to really make a living out of the scandal, the holes, the loopholes in boxing, and that'd have to be Don King. Don King even created his own tournament. This guy really pushed it to the limit.
And that ended up in scandal.
Yeah, it ended up all the time. And that's what I'm saying. The tournament itself, tell us about the tournament, how scandalous it became.
Well, the premise of the tournament was they saw that people in America, there were two managers, Al Brave and Patty Flood, worked with King, American managers, at a low grade level. But they saw that all the champs were becoming non-American. You know, traditionally, all the champs were American. They have Carlos Monzon and Jose Napoles and Duran. I said, what's going on here? Let's give a shot to American fighters. Well, the ring, you know, what had happened, the fellow who started the ring, Nat Fleischer, had been there long past the time he should retire. He was into his mid-80s. The problem was the entire staff, people like Dan Daniel and Sam Taub, they were in their 80s too. You would walk into there, it was like a time machine. It was like 1910 with these 85-year-old men walking around there. And they're writing stories about Jack Dempsey, as we're talking today, John Ellis. But the current fight, they're just avoiding. Carlos Monzon didn't exist to them. So there's a young guy, John Ort, there. He sees they don't pay them anything to ring. So what he does, he'll manipulate the ratings. You give him $100, your guy goes in the top 10, or $500, maybe goes to the #1 contender. So he starts manipulating. And these old guys, they're oblivious to it. They're talking old things that happened 60 years ago, and who cares about the ratings? So they were getting decadent in the ring. So to revive them and try to revive American boxing, but really to fill their pockets, they said, look, let's have a tournament all American fighters only, which was a great idea in concept. The problem is the reality was they were controlling who gets in. It was an invitational tournament that Don King's cronies controlled the invitations. So while Marvin Hagler and Matthew Saad Muhammad and some of the best heavyweights in the world were not going in, they had these guys from New England, you know, who had beaten 20 cab drivers, and they're fighting for the title and they're fighting for this tournament. And then what happens after a couple of controversial fights, a lot of people started complaining, said, we're not in the tournament. We have to pay a kickback, a backhander to somebody to get in there. Why is this?
God forbid they tell people that's the case.
Absolutely. Well, if they had been in the tournament, there would have been no complaint. But the fact that they couldn't get, or the rates were too high for them to pay, that was the problem. So now you're talking about ABC, which is a publicly traded corporation, not what goes on in the backroom of boxing, because as we say, we forgive everything. There's no morality in boxing. Bill Daly, a manager, once said to me, the only crime in boxing is not making money. And everything else is acceptable. And so with King, they whatever they can do, they'll turn a silk person to a sow's ear. So this great concept fell apart, and everybody's complaining to kickbacks. And so they take it off the air. The ring's credibility, which was questioned at that point, just completely collapsed until Bert Sugar bought the company and revived it, the magazine. But as we say with boxing, everything's forgiven. Don King goes on. He starts making millions and millions and more millions. Unbelievable. There's nothing you can do in this business, I'm telling you, that will shock the public, maybe for a short period of time, but long enough to say we got to get rid of him. And he still remains as iconic kind of a figure. He's 91 years of age, and he just had a scandal with Daniel Dubois. Didn't want to pay him because Frank Warren owed him money from 22 years ago. It's just they're totally oblivious to criticism, and they get away with it.
They get away with it because I suppose they're allowed to get away with it because they're allowed to still operate. Why are they allowed to still operate? Maybe because they know something about somebody else, or somebody else won't try and stop them from operating and get involved in the game itself. Then we'll look at things outside of the fight game. A bit of tongue in cheek. Frank Maloney. Frank Maloney, he was the one that really raised a lot of eyebrows and courageous for what he did. with himself. You think, wow, then Frank still trying to stay inside the box, and I think he eventually drifted out of it. But Frank becoming Kelly Maloney, and that was a big question.
Well, I take that on a personal level because we worked together with Lennox Lewis, for a long time, and other fighters that he had, and we would run around, and he would run around chasing women. There was never any hint of this. And I got a note from Eddie Hearn. He sent me an email. He said, prepared to be shocked. And then I get this email, not an email, it was a fax. And it's coming through, and you saw this picture of Frank Maloney. It was on an operating table, and Frank Maloney has, I guess, transsexual operation, whatever it was. And I thought initially, John, that this was one of these headlines. You can go down to Piccadilly Circus or here in Times Square, get a headline. I don't know. Johnny Nelson elected Tsar of Russia, Don Majeski with the Nobel Prize for stupidity. So I said, it must have been made up. No, they start sending me the Sun, and they start sending me the Mirror, and it was the front page, obviously, everywhere. And he waited till he was about 60 to do this. That's the other thing. You think some young kid, and he goes into his puberty and feels he's one sex or another, or she is. But this guy waited, and he had 3 daughters, and he had a wife. And it was shocking. And knowing him, he was never effeminate or anything like that. I don't know. It's beyond me.
And then Don, the thing is, everybody that I know had absolutely no idea until he did it. Yes. Absolutely no idea. And that was probably the shock of it all.
Absolutely. And again, I can tell you crazy stories. He was chasing an ex-girlfriend of his. He thought he was cheating. We're climbing up he's going to the drain pipe, and I'm lifting him up so he can look in the window. Insane. And with women, I mean, this guy was a womanizer. Now, was that compensating for whatever he felt? I don't know. But there was no inclination. It was amazing. The last time we spoke, he had a fight. He had the fighter who got knocked out he was from Liverpool, big, tall heavyweight.
David Price.
David Price. And he was despondent. He lost twice, and I'm going away. So I called him about a week later. I got him back to New York. And I said, Frank, you okay? He said, yeah, I'm at a retreat in Portugal, Buddhist retreat. I said, what? Yeah, all right. But maybe he's transitioning then. I don't know. But it just came out unbelievable, incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that makes story. There are many, many more stories in boxing that would write a completely different book without even having to throw a glove or write about a fight itself, things outside the sport. A lot of things we can't actually talk about here anyway. Don, interesting as per usual. Thank you very much for that. And I'm quite sure it will raise quite a few eyebrows.
But we always do in boxing, don't we? I mean, we never shut our eyes to anything either.